A deadly situation unfolds on a bus when the police dog in the back refuses to get off, and what the driver does when he notices will leave you amazed. The bus driver saw the red light a few hundred meters ahead, so he lifted his foot off the gas pedal and instinctively began to slow down. He felt the sharp tip of the knife pressing against the soft skin behind his left ear. "No, don't do it," said the criminal behind him. "Don't slow down and don't stop." The driver glanced in the rearview mirror, the flashing blue lights of two patrol cars following at a distance. Safe. The driver also saw the German Shepherd lying in the aisle behind him. The dog looked relaxed, but the driver knew him, and he could see that he was on high alert. His ears were pointed forward and his muscles were taut. His eyes were focused on the man with the knife. At least, I have one ally on the bus, the driver thought. He didn't know yet, but he had another ally outside the bus. An hour ago, Donovan Higgins was in his driveway working on his vintage car. For years, owning a piece of history on four wheels had been his dream. While he was working as an officer, his daughter Maggie waved to him as she wandered down the driveway. Bear, the giant German shepherd, was following her closely. "Be careful, sweetheart," he said, waving his hand. She laughed and said, "I have Bear with me, Dad. I'm safer than anyone." Then she turned left and disappeared down the road. Dawn always felt a little uneasy when Maggie headed into town by herself, but she was right. With Bear around, she'd be safe, wouldn't she? Dawn's mind began to wander through memories of the past. He and Bear had been true partners for years, 7 years. He couldn't even remember all the arrests they'd made. Bear was fearless and the smartest dog he'd ever worked with. He had an extraordinary ability to spot criminals in crowds, and that was often the key to getting extremely dangerous people off the streets. They only failed once, but he didn't want to think about that anymore. He was retired. And eventually, someone else would be able to catch the young criminals who were terrorizing the city. Maggie and Bear didn't have to wait long for the bus to arrive. The driver knew them both and patted the dog's ears as they got on. Maggie headed to a seat near the back of the bus with Bear. She sat down, put her earphones in, leaned her head back, and closed her eyes next to him. Bear was breathing loudly as he scanned the other passengers. Once he was sure there was no threat to Maggie, he rested his head on his front paws, but his eyes didn't close. After 10 minutes, Bear's attitude completely changed. A young man in his late 20s boarded the bus, and the dog felt that something about this man bothered him. The big German shepherd shifted slightly so he could keep the man in his line of sight. After 2 stops, another young man got on, and Bear became more agitated. The man sat next to the first man, and now the dog was on high alert. Over his years as a police dog, these instincts had been honed to a sharp edge. He trusted himself and knew that he knew when something was wrong. He put his head in Maggie's lap and made a soft sound. At first, she just thought he wanted some petting, and she started to scratch between his ears. But when Bear's quiet whining continued, Maggie realized he was trying to get her attention. She had known Bear since he was a puppy, and she knew to take it seriously when he tried to tell her something. Maggie looked at Bear and followed his gaze to the 2 young men sitting near the front of the bus. Then the dog moved closer to her, positioning himself between her and the potential threat. Suddenly, Maggie felt afraid. She unplugged her earphones from her phone and sent a message to her father. "I think there's a problem on the bus." "Dad," Maggie wrote, "Bear is uneasy about the 2 young men who got on 2 stops ago." His blood turned cold as ice when he read the message, ignoring the grease on his fingers, and replied immediately, "What should I do?" Maggie looked at Bear and replied that he was on high alert. "Dad, he doesn't take his eyes off them." Don felt his heart tighten when he read the reply. When Bear did this, it meant the situation was serious. In all their years together, Bear had never been wrong. "Can you take a picture without them noticing?" Maggie slid into her seat and carefully looked at the 2 young men. They seemed to be having some kind of conversation, tense, maybe even a little worried, but they were looking at each other, which meant she would be able to photograph their faces at least. She took a few pictures and sent them to her father. If he had been panicked before, Don suddenly became terrified. The men in the picture in front of him, the men on the bus with his daughter, were members of the gang that had eluded him for years. "I want you to get off at the next stop. Pretend it's your stop. Don't look at them. Just get off the bus. Let me know immediately when you get off. Maggie did exactly what she was asked, skillfully. She left her seat and walked to the front of the bus. Isn't this your usual stop? The driver asked. No, she replied as cheerfully as she could. Just another stop today. When she stepped onto the sidewalk and heard the bus doors close with a beep, she texted her father, I've gotten off. She felt relieved, but then she looked around for Bear and felt her heart sink. He wasn't with her. Bear stayed on the bus. Bear isn't with me, Dad. I think he stayed on the bus. Don felt a lump in his throat. His daughter was safe. Don't worry about Bear. He can take care of himself. After that, Don called his old office and informed them of the situation. Police dispatch sent police cars even before he finished speaking. When he hung up, he jumped into his Jeep and headed for the bus route. He had been retired for almost a year, but those criminals were unfinished business. And today was the day that unfinished business would be completed. On the bus, the driver began to notice that Burr was crawling forward on his belly. The dog was doing it very slowly so that no one would notice. The man and the dog exchanged glances in the rearview mirror, and the driver was sure that Burr was communicating with him. He was telling him to keep doing what he was doing, and somewhere inside, he knew that the dog would let him know when the time was right. The police cars following the bus had turned on their sirens, making the criminals more nervous in the rearview mirror. Bear moved forward again. He was now sitting directly behind the criminals. The driver looked ahead once more. The bus was approaching a traffic light, and if he sped up as the criminals wanted, he would put them all in great danger. But if he didn't, the men would take the passengers hostage. He needed a distraction, and he needed it now. Fortunately, the dog sitting in the aisle could provide the perfect diversion. When their eyes met again, Pierre flapped his ears and crouched down. The driver understood this as a signal, and what he did next left all his passengers in a state of astonishment without any warning. With a hard press on the brakes, the criminal with the knife almost flew through the windshield and staggered back to regain his balance. At that moment, Pierre jumped. The criminal and the dog met in midair. Pierre's huge body struck the man with such force that he lost his breath instantly. Without wasting a second, Pierre attacked the second criminal. The man was trying to escape down the aisle to the back of the bus, but the dog caught him halfway and easily dragged him back. The bus stopped, and 3 fully uniformed officers boarded with their weapons drawn. When Pierre got off the bus, Don was waiting for him next to Maggie. The dog ran toward his family, happy that he had performed one last service. And when both the driver and Pierre received a medal for their bravery a few days later, they knew this was the happy ending they deserved. What a scary adventure! Have you ever seen a real police dog in action? Would you have understood the signal in the driver's position?